6 days have passed since the checkered flag dropped in Miami, yet the controversy refuses to fade. The penalties have been issued, points have been awarded, and the championship standings updated. The next race is just days away. Still, every single day this week has brought fresh revelations that make the FIA's decisions look even more questionable than they did at the time. Yesterday, another bombshell landed. A driver competing in the FIA's own World Endurance Championship publicly called out the governing body for applying double standards. His statement spread rapidly across every major Formula One platform. What started as a post-race debate has now evolved into something much larger. A serious test of whether the FIA, barely 3 weeks after promising drivers a new era of cooperation and transparency, has squandered what remained of its credibility in one chaotic weekend. By the end of this, you'll see exactly why this story keeps growing, why the inconsistencies matter so deeply, and why the upcoming race at Imola could prove to be one of the most significant events of the entire 2026 season, even if few are framing it that way yet. Let's walk through the timeline because the sequence of events is crucial. It was May 3rd in Miami. The race concluded, and shortly afterward Charles Leclerc received a hefty 20-second time penalty for cutting multiple corners on the final lap. His Ferrari was severely compromised after contact with the wall, the left side suspension was damaged, and the car could no longer turn properly to the right. Leclerc himself reported the issue over team radio, and the team backed it up when speaking to the stewards. Despite this, the FIA's official verdict contained a single damning line that has fueled outrage ever since. They stated that the mechanical problem did not amount to a justifiable reason. As a result, 6th place became 8th and Leclerc was demoted behind his own teammate. But the penalties didn't stop there. Later that evening the stewards issued another one, this time a 5-second addition for Max Verstappen. The offense: his front left tire had crossed the outside of the solid white line at pit exit during his sole stop. What makes this particularly controversial is buried in the stewards' own report. They admitted there was limited video evidence available during the actual race. They had to search for additional camera angles after the checkered flag, eventually issuing the decision more than 2 hours later using footage that simply wasn't accessible in real time. The race result was literally rewritten with evidence that didn't exist while the cars were still running. Now consider the other calls made by the same group of stewards under the same rulebook that weekend. Leclerc, fighting to finish in a broken car by taking chicanes, received 20 seconds. Verstappen, whose tire barely strayed over a line, received 5. Meanwhile, George Russell was involved in a final lap wheel-to-wheel collision involving actual car-to-car contact. Both drivers described it as a minor racing incident. The stewards agreed, issued no penalty, and moved on without further investigation. The lack of consistent logic is striking. Surviving in a damaged car and cutting corners drew harsher punishment than physical contact between two competitors. And there's more. On the opening lap, Lewis Hamilton made contact with Franco Colapinto's Alpine, which damaged his own Ferrari and affected his entire race. In the heat of the moment, broadcast and onboard cameras clearly captured Hamilton directing a middle finger toward Colapinto. The gesture was unmistakable and widely seen, yet the FIA took no action, no penalty, no fine, no public comment. This became explosive when, on May 7th, a driver named Danny Junedella, who has competed alongside Verstappen in GT events and races in the FIA's World Endurance Championship, spoke out. He revealed that he himself had been fined €2,000 by the same governing body last season for making an identical gesture during an endurance race. Same organization, same action, same visibility. One driver punished, another completely ignored in a higher-profile event. What began as fan frustration on forums has now become professional drivers openly accusing the FIA of treating its own regulations as flexible guidelines rather than consistent rules. When you lay out all the incidents from that single weekend, the pattern is difficult to dismiss. Liam Lawson flipped Pierre Gasly in a heavy crash, right arrow, no further action. A driver disqualified from the sprint for a technical issue. Hamilton's visible gesture ignored. Russell's contact, right arrow, minor incident. Verstappen penalized via post-race footage. Leclerc penalized for managing a broken car. 6 separate situations, 6 wildly different outcomes. The only common thread some observers point to is the political and relational standing of those involved within the paddock. Drivers perceived as less connected to current FIA leadership or less vocal in challenging stewards appear to face stricter scrutiny. There is even open discussion in major fan communities, suggesting that certain high-profile but relatively quiet drivers are being used as examples to demonstrate toughness. I'm not declaring that theory as fact, but the fact that it is being discussed so widely tells you how much trust has eroded. Just 3 weeks earlier, on April 20th, the FIA had pushed through significant 2026 power unit regulation changes after an emergency process. They repeatedly emphasized that drivers were at the heart of those decisions. Yet in the very first race following those promises, the stewarding delivered what many view as the most inconsistent performance in recent memory. On the podium, Lando Norris made a telling remark that received surprisingly little follow-up. He noted that drivers would still face penalties for trying to push harder, even with the new rule adjustments. A leading driver essentially saying the promised reforms hadn't altered the underlying issues. The FIA has remained silent on all of this. No clarification on the gesture discrepancy. No explanation for why a mechanical failure wasn't considered mitigating for Leclerc but contact was dismissed for Russell. No response to the growing accusations of double standards. This raises a deeper question for the sport. How many times can controversies like this be allowed to simply fade with the news cycle before the relationship between drivers and the governing body suffers permanent damage? Because that is the real issue emerging from Miami. Not just the individual penalties, but the growing sense among drivers that fairness cannot be reliably expected. When that belief settles in, behavior changes. Drivers become more conservative on track. They protect their points and their licenses rather than committing fully to risky but legitimate moves. Marginal opportunities get left on the table. The racing suffers. The painful irony is unmistakable. The FIA spent weeks rewriting rules specifically to encourage more aggressive, flat-out racing and better entertainment. Then, in the first race afterward, their own decisions created powerful incentives for drivers to be more cautious instead. Now the paddock heads to Imola, a circuit that is narrow, demanding, and far less forgiving than Miami. Walls are closer, runoff areas are tighter, and any mistake in energy management or cornering is immediately punished. Drivers will arrive carrying the unresolved questions from Miami. Can they trust that a bold move at the Tamburello chicane won't be second-guessed with later footage? Will a wheel slightly over a curb result in a post-race time penalty? Will contact at Variant Alta be judged consistently with previous incidents? If the answer in their minds is no, the racing will inevitably tighten up. Cars will follow in formation more often. Overtaking opportunities will be passed up. And fans will likely blame the drivers for the lack of action when the root cause lies elsewhere. Every controversy, the swearing incidents, the Andretti decision, steward controversies, rushed events, and now Miami, represents another withdrawal from the sport's bank of trust and legitimacy. Individually, they can be weathered. Collectively, they risk something far more serious, a slow erosion of the credibility that has made Formula One the premier motorsport in the world. Drivers are noticing, they speak more cautiously in interviews, they choose their words carefully. The open frustration of previous years has been replaced by calculated diplomacy. That shift is not a sign of a healthy sport. So here is the question worth discussing. What should the FIA do now before Imola begins? Should they issue a public explanation addressing the clear inconsistencies, the differing treatment of the gesture, the broken car penalty versus the contact incident, and the use of retroactive footage? Should they directly respond to the concerns raised by drivers like Norris? Or should they stay silent, hope the Imola headlines overshadow Miami the way previous races overshadowed earlier controversies, and allow the story to die? Their choice in the coming days will speak volumes about the direction of the sport for the rest of 2026 and beyond. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the FIA damaged its own credibility in Miami, or is this simply another storm that will pass? The answers and the racing at Imola will tell us a lot.